The room was too quiet for a woman in that much pain. Amara Johnson lay on the hospital bed, her fingers curled around the metal railing so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She was 38 weeks pregnant, her belly swollen and heavy, her body doing what bodies have done since the beginning of time, fighting to bring life into the world. But something was wrong. Not with the baby. Not with her body. Something was wrong with the room itself. With the air inside it. With the way the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were indifferent to her suffering. With the way the door had been closed just a little too firmly when the nurse walked in. She had arrived at Silver Crest Medical Center 3 hours earlier, her contractions 5 minutes apart, her hospital bag packed, her husband's number on speed dial. Silver Crest was not just any hospital. It was the kind of place where the lobby had fresh flowers every morning and the front desk staff smiled like they had been trained by a luxury hotel chain. It was the kind of place where wealthy families came to have their children in comfort and safety. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. And yet, Amara's eyes moved to the door. Then to the monitor beside her bed. The numbers were climbing. The contractions were getting closer. She pressed the call button for the 3rd time in 20 minutes and waited, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts the way her birthing class instructor had taught her. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Stay calm. Stay focused. The baby is coming and everything is going to be fine. The door opened. Nurse Choi Yirin stepped inside. She was a small woman, sharp-featured, with her hair pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin around her temples. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this job for years and had long since stopped seeing patients as people. She glanced at the monitor, then at her clipboard, then, finally, at Amara. "You pressed the call button again," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Amara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The contractions are getting stronger. I need something for the pain. I asked the last nurse and she said she would check." "I know what you asked." Nurse Choi set her clipboard on the counter and crossed her arms. "And I already told you. Your file needs to be reviewed before we authorize anything." "That was 40 minutes ago." Amara's voice cracked slightly at the edges. 40 minutes. My contractions are 3 minutes apart now. 3 minutes. I can feel the pressure changing. Something is happening and I need. "What you need," Nurse Choi said, her voice dropping to something low and deliberate, "is to calm down." Amara stared at her. "I am calm," she said quietly. "I am very calm. I am asking you, as calmly as I can, to please help me. I am in labor. That is what this room is for. That is what you are here for." Something shifted in Nurse Choi's expression. Something that Amara could not name in that moment, but would later describe to the detective as the look of a person who had already decided what they were going to do before they walked through the door. "Women have been giving birth for thousands of years without making this much noise," Nurse Choi said. Amara felt the words land somewhere deep in her chest. "Excuse me. You heard me. And before we go any further into what happened inside that room, before you hear what that nurse said next, before you find out who was really behind what happened that night, and before you discover the name of the man who walked into that hospital and turned the entire institution upside down, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Seriously. Drop your city or your country in the comments because these stories travel farther than we ever expect, and every time we read those comments it reminds us why we tell them. And if nobody has told you to subscribe yet, consider this your sign. Hit that button. Because what happens next in this story is something you will want to be here for. Let's go back inside that room. Amara's hand tightened around the bed railing. "I need you to leave," she said. "And I need you to send someone else in. Anyone else." Nurse Choi did not move toward the door. She moved toward the monitor instead, reaching over and adjusting something on the screen in a way that made the display harder for Amara to read from where she was lying. "You don't get to make that request," she said flatly. "I am your assigned nurse. You are my patient. And my professional assessment is that you are not in the kind of distress that requires additional intervention at this time." "Your professional assessment," Amara stopped herself. Another contraction was building, low and wide and crushing, radiating from her back all the way around to her front, and she gripped the railing and breathed through it, eyes closed, jaw tight, every muscle in her body focused on surviving the next 60 seconds. When it passed, she opened her eyes. Nurse Choi was watching her with an expression that was not concern. "Please," Amara said. She hated that she had to say it. She hated the smallness of the word in that moment. But she said it anyway because she was not there for herself anymore. She had not been doing anything for herself since the moment she found out she was pregnant. Everything she did for the child. "Please. Whatever is happening between you and me, whatever your problem is, this is not about me anymore. There is a baby coming. Please just do your job." Nurse Choi looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her clipboard, walked to the door, and locked it. Amara heard the click of the lock like a gunshot in a silent room. "What are you doing?" Her voice came out higher than she intended. "Why did you lock the door? Unlock the door. Unlock it right now. Lower your voice. Unlock the door." Nurse Choi turned around slowly. Her expression had not changed. That was the part that was most frightening. Not the anger, not the cruelty, but the complete and total absence of either. She looked like someone performing a task. Like someone following instructions. "If you keep screaming," she said, "I will note in your file that you are emotionally unstable and a danger to yourself. And then this becomes a very different kind of situation for you." Amara's mouth went dry. She understood then, with the particular clarity that comes to people in moments of real danger, that she was not dealing with a nurse who had lost her temper. She was not dealing with someone who was having a bad day or who carried a private prejudice she could not control. She was dealing with something calculated. Something deliberate. Something that had been decided before Amara ever checked in at the front desk. She reached for her phone on the bedside table. Nurse Choi was faster. She picked it up and placed it on the counter behind her, just out of reach. "You can have it back when we're done," she said. "Done with what?" Amara's voice was shaking now. Not from fear alone. From the effort of holding herself together through another contraction that was already beginning to build at the base of her spine. "Done with what? What are you doing? What is this?" Nurse Choi pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. She crossed one leg over the other. She looked almost comfortable. And then she said something that Amara would repeat word for word in every statement she gave afterward, because it was so specific and so strange and so clearly rehearsed that she never forgot a single syllable of it. "Some people," Nurse Choi said, "come into spaces they were never meant to occupy. And they act surprised when the space pushes back." The contraction hit. Amara arched against it, her whole body seizing with the force of it, and she cried out. Not a scream, not hysteria, just the raw involuntary sound of a human body in extremis, and Nurse Choi sat in her chair and watched and did not move. When it passed, Amara was trembling. Sweat had broken out along her hairline. She could feel the baby moving lower. She knew what that meant. She had read every book. She had attended every appointment. She knew her own body, and she knew that time was shortening and that what was happening in this room was not a disagreement anymore. It was an emergency. "I need a doctor," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. Not because she was giving up. Because she was conserving every resource she had left. "Not you. A doctor. Please." Nurse Choi's phone buzzed on her hip. She looked down at the screen. "Read something." And for just a moment, just one fraction of a second, her expression shifted. Not into guilt. Not into hesitation. Into something that looked almost like confirmation. Like someone had just told her she was doing exactly the right thing. She typed back a response. Slipped the phone into her pocket. And looked up at Amara with the same flat, controlled expression she had worn since she walked through the door. Amara had seen it. She did not know what it meant yet. She did not know who was on the other end of that message. She did not know that the answer to that question would eventually bring down an entire institution, expose a conspiracy that had been running for 5 years, and change the lives of everyone inside that hospital forever. She only knew what she could see. And what she could see was a woman who was receiving instructions. Across the city, in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of the Siren Financial Tower, Kong Min-jae was doing what powerful men do when they want to remind other powerful men of their position. He was being very, very still. He sat at the head of a long mahogany table, his jacket perfectly pressed, his hands flat on the surface in front of him, his eyes moving from face to face with the slow deliberateness of someone who has never once in his adult life felt the need to hurry. He was 41 years old, and he had built his empire through a combination of ruthlessness, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to read the people in front of him. 3 men sat across from him now. Business associates, they called themselves. Partners. Min Jae called them something else privately, but he kept that to himself. The restructuring proposal, said the man on the left, a heavy-set developer named Beck who wore too much cologne and smiled too quickly, is straightforward. We're asking you to step back from the Eastern Corridor contracts. Purely administrative. The new regulatory environment makes your involvement complicated, said the man in the center, a lawyer named Shin whose voice had the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent 30 years saying terrible things in pleasant tones. That is one word for it, Min Jae said. We have others, said the third man. His name was Oh Dae-young, and he was the one Min Jae was actually watching, because Oh Dae-young was the only one at the table who was not performing. He was simply waiting. And people who are simply waiting in rooms like this are always the most dangerous ones. I'm sure you do, Min Jae said. You've always been creative with language, Dae-young. I'll give you that. Oh Dae-young smiled with only his mouth. Min Jae's phone vibrated against his thigh. He did not look at it. The Eastern Corridor, he said, generates 30% of the consolidated revenue for 6 subsidiary entities, 2 of which have pension obligations to over 400 employees. You're asking me to step back from that. Which means you're asking me to step back from the people whose livelihoods depend on it. And you're framing it as administration. He let the word sit in the air for a moment. I find that interesting. It is what it is, Beck said, his smile becoming slightly more fixed. Most things are, Min Jae agreed pleasantly. His phone vibrated again. Then again. 3 times in rapid succession. He kept his eyes on Oh Dae-young. The door behind him opened and Jang Tae-ho stepped inside. Min Jae's security chief was a man who communicated almost entirely through posture and expression, and what his posture and expression communicated right now was urgent without being panic. Which meant it was serious but contained. Which meant it was personal. Min Jae held up one finger to the men across the table. A gesture that managed to be simultaneously polite and utterly dismissive. He turned. Tae-ho leaned down and said 4 words quietly into his ear. Min Jae's face did not change. This was a skill he had spent years developing, the ability to receive information that shook him to his foundations without letting a single tremor reach the surface. He nodded once. Stood. Buttoned his jacket. Gentlemen, he said, we'll reschedule. We're in the middle of... Beck began. We'll reschedule, Min Jae said again, and this time there was nothing pleasant in his voice at all, and Beck stopped talking immediately. Oh Dae-young watched Min Jae walk toward the door. His expression did not change. But his eyes, Min Jae noticed as he passed, his eyes moved to the phone in his jacket pocket. Just briefly. Just for a moment. Min Jae filed that away and kept walking. In the elevator, descending 42 floors toward the parking garage, he finally looked at his phone. 6 missed calls from Tae-ho. 2 from the hospital's main line. 1 from a number he didn't recognize. Tell me everything, he said to Tae-ho standing beside him. The hospital called the secondary line when they couldn't reach you directly. Mrs. Johnson was admitted 3 hours ago. Standard labor, no complications flagged at intake. But the floor nurse reported, Tae-ho paused, choosing the word carefully, an incident. The attending physician tried to enter the room 20 minutes ago and found the door locked from the inside. Min Jae stared at the elevator doors. Locked from the inside, he repeated. Yes. By whom? The assigned nurse. The elevator reached the garage. The doors opened. Min Jae was already moving. Get the car, he said. And get me the name of that nurse. The drive across Siren City took 11 minutes. Min Jae spent those 11 minutes doing something that people who knew him would have found unrecognizable. He sat in the back seat of his car and he was afraid. Not the operational fear of a man calculating risk. Not the strategic fear of a man anticipating opposition. Pure, private, unguarded fear, the kind that has no strategy attached to it, the kind that belongs only to people who have something they cannot afford to lose. He had been careful. He had been so careful. He had chosen Silvercrest because it was supposed to be the safest place in the city. He had paid for the best room, the best team, the best everything. He had structured his business affairs so that Amara existed in a completely separate world from all of it, clean and protected and untouchable. He had done everything right. And someone had still found a way in. He knew, sitting in that car, watching Siren blur past the tinted windows, that this was not random. A locked door. A nurse who would not respond to the attending physician. His phone flooded with calls during a meeting that had been scheduled for weeks. He knew what orchestration looked like. He had orchestrated enough things in his life to recognize it in others. The question was not whether this was deliberate. The question was who had the reach, the knowledge, and the willingness to go after a pregnant woman in a hospital. He thought of Oh De-young's eyes moving to his phone as he left the room. He thought of a name. He kept that thought entirely to himself. Silvercrest Medical Center appeared ahead, its glass facade glowing softly in the early evening light. Min Jae was out of the car before it fully stopped, moving through the entrance with Tae-ho 2 steps behind him and 2 additional members of his security team flanking wide. He did not run. Running in lobbies created panic, and panic created complications. He walked with the particular velocity of a man who has made a decision and will not be interrupted in the execution of it. The lobby staff looked up. Nobody spoke. This happened to Min Jae in rooms sometimes. His presence had a quality that was difficult to name, not just authority, not just money, but something older and more instinctive than either. The quality of a person around whom other people instinctively recalibrate. He reached the front desk. "Kong Min Jae," he said. "My wife was admitted this evening. Amara Johnson Kong. Maternity wing. Take me to her." The receptionist, to her credit, did not fumble. She looked at her screen, looked at him, and made a decision. "Follow me," she said. The maternity wing of Silvercrest smelled of antiseptic and fresh linen, and it was decorated with a particular aggressively soothing aesthetic of expensive medical facilities. Soft lighting, muted colors, watercolor prints of abstract flowers. Min Jae walked through it and noticed things that other people might not have noticed. The way 2 nurses at the station end of the corridor made eye contact with each other when he appeared. The way one of them reached for her phone before apparently thinking better of it. The way the door to room 14, Amara's room, had a quality of stillness around it that was different from the other doors. He tried the handle. Locked. Something moved through him that was not quite anger and not quite fear but occupied the territory between them. "Open this door," he said to the nurse who had escorted him, his voice completely level. "Sir, the assigned nurse has." "Open this door," he said again, in exactly the same tone, and the nurse looked at him and apparently concluded that the complications of not opening the door were greater than the complications of opening it, because she produced a key card from her lanyard and swiped it across the panel. The door opened. The first thing Min Jae saw was Amara. She was on the bed, curled slightly to one side, her face sheened with sweat, her eyes closed in the concentrated expression of someone managing pain alone. Her hands were gripping the railing. The monitor beside her showed numbers that Min Jae could not fully interpret, but that produced in him a visceral, immediate alarm. She had not heard the door open. She was too deep inside whatever she was enduring to hear anything. The second thing he saw was Nurse Choi Yirin, standing at the counter with her back partially toward the door, her phone in her hand, typing something. She turned at the sound of his entry. Her expression cycled through surprise, recalibration, and then, and this was the thing that Min Jae would remember longest, a very brief, very contained flash of something that looked almost like defiance. The third thing he saw was Amara's phone, sitting on the counter behind the nurse. Min Jae walked past Nurse Choi without looking at her. He crossed to the bed, lowered himself to one knee beside it, and put his hand over Amara's hand on the railing. She opened her eyes. "Min Jae," she said. And then she could not say anything else because she was crying, the kind of crying that comes out of relief and exhaustion and the collapse of the composure someone has been holding through sheer force of will, and she did not make any attempt to stop it. "I'm here," he said quietly. "I'm right here. Look at me. I'm here." Amara's voice broke apart. "She locked the door. She took my phone. She sat there and I know." He kept his voice steady for her. "I know. It's over now. I'm here and it's over." He held her hand for a moment longer. Then he stood up. He turned around. Nurse Choi was still standing at the counter. She had not moved. She was watching him with an expression that was not quite what he expected. He had expected fear, defensiveness, apology. What he saw instead was the expression of someone who had already accepted consequences. The expression of someone who knew the weight of what they were carrying and had decided it was worth it. That was the detail that told him everything. "What is your name?" he asked, though he already knew it. "Choi Yirin," she said. "Choi Yirin." He folded his hands in front of him. "You locked my wife in this room. You took her phone. You withheld pain relief from a woman in active labor. You watched her suffer." He paused. "Look at her." Nurse Choi looked at Amara. "Look at what you did," Min-jae said. Something moved across Nurse Choi's face. Not remorse, or not entirely. Something more complicated. Something that looked, for just a moment, like grief. "Why?" Min-jae asked. His voice had not risen once. It would not rise. He had learned long ago that the most terrifying thing a man like him could do in a room was stay completely calm. "Tell me why." Nurse Choi opened her mouth. What she said next was not what he expected. "You still don't understand what's happening," she said. "Do you?" Min-jae looked at her. "You think this is about me," she said. "You think I locked that door because of something I decided. You think I'm the one you're looking for." She stopped, looked down at her phone, then back up at him. "I'm not. I'm really not." "Then tell me who is." Her jaw tightened. "I can't," she said. "Can't," Min-jae repeated. "Or won't." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something that resolved itself slowly, the way shapes resolve in fog. He saw a person who was afraid. Not of him. Of something else. Something that had enough weight and reach to make a woman do what she had just done to another woman in a locked hospital room. "I want a lawyer," she said. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned away from her, dismissing her from his attention with the completeness of a man closing a door. He turned to Tae-ho, who had been standing at the entrance to the room with the stillness of someone trained not to exist until needed. "Get a doctor in here," Min-jae said. "A real one. And nobody leaves this wing." Tae-ho was already moving. Another contraction came for Amara, and Min-jae was back at her side before she could reach for the railing alone, and he took her hand and held it, and she squeezed with everything she had, and he let her, and he did not make a sound. In room 14 of the Silver Crest maternity wing, amid the soft lighting and the antiseptic smell and the hum of the monitor, something had shifted. The nurse who had locked the door stood in the corner and said nothing. The man that half of Siren City feared sat on the edge of his wife's bed and held her hand. And somewhere beyond the hospital walls, in a place that had not yet been named or found, someone looked at their phone and read a message and understood that the situation had changed. They had not expected him to arrive so quickly. They had not planned for that. And the thing about plans made by people who believe they are untouchable is that they are almost always made without accounting for the one variable that changes everything. Love. 30 minutes later, Nurse Eun Hanul arrived. She was different from the moment she walked through the door, different in the way that some people are simply, constitutionally, essentially different. She was in her late 40s, with a kind of face that has been softened rather than hardened by years of other people's worst moments, and she moved with a quiet purposefulness that was nothing like Nurse Choi's efficiency. Where Nurse Choi's efficiency had been the efficiency of someone executing, Nurse Eun's purposefulness was the purposefulness of someone caring. She assessed Amara in 30 seconds. Checked the monitor. Checked her chart. Looked at the 4-line. Adjusted something with practiced hands. "Okay," she said, pulling a chair to the bedside with the naturalness of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "I'm Hanul. I'm going to be with you until your daughter arrives. Is that all right?" Amara looked at her. Then, for the first time in hours, she exhaled. "Yes," she said. "That's all right." "Good." Nurse Eun looked at Min-jae. "And you're the husband." "I am." "Good. You're staying." It was not a question. Min-jae almost smiled. "I wasn't planning to leave," he said. "Excellent." She turned back to Amara. "Now, tell me where the pain is strongest and we'll start there." What followed was the slowest and most excruciating and most extraordinary hour of Kong Min-jae's life. He had overseen negotiations that lasted 3 days without sleep. He had sat across from men who had made genuine, specific threats against his life and had not flinched. He had navigated the collapse of a 9-figure deal in real time and rebuilt it in 48 hours. None of that had prepared him for this. For the particular agony of watching someone he loved fight a battle he could not fight for her. He held her hand through every contraction. He adjusted the pillow behind her back when she asked. He got ice chips from the machine in the hall and held the cup while she took them one at a time. He listened to Nursoon's calm instructions, and he did what he was told without question, because in this room, in this hour, Nursoon was the authority and he understood that completely. At one point Amara looked at him between contractions, her face exhausted and damp and more open than he had ever seen it, stripped of every layer that people wear in the world, down to the bare absolute self beneath all of it, and she said, "I was so scared." "I know," he said. "I kept thinking about her. About whether she could feel what I was feeling." "She couldn't," he said, with a certainty he had no medical basis for, but that he believed completely. "She was warm and safe and waiting for you. She still is." Amara held his eyes for a moment. "Don't let go," she said. "Never," he said. And he meant it in every sense of the word. At 11:47 in the evening, Naomi Grace Kong entered the world. She arrived with the particular insistence of someone who has been waiting long enough, and Nursoon placed her on Amara's chest, and Amara made a sound that was not crying and not laughing but somewhere in the trembling space between them, and Min-jae, who had not cried in the presence of another person since he was 9 years old, sat beside his wife and his daughter and was undone completely. He did not try to stop it. He did not manage it or contain it or redirect it into something more controlled. He simply felt it, the full, devastating, life-rearranging weight of it, and let it move through him like weather. Naomi Grace was 7 pounds and 4 ounces, and she had Amara's nose and her father's stubborn expression, and she was perfect in every way that the word perfect has ever been meant. Min-jae put one finger in her hand, and she closed her fist around it with a strength that startled him. "Hello," he said softly. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for you." He looked up at Amara. She was watching him with an expression he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for. "She has your grip," Amara said. "She has your everything," he said. Outside room 14, in the corridor of the maternity wing, things were less peaceful. Tae-ho had positioned 2 men at either end of the hall. Nurse Choi had been escorted to the administrative wing and was sitting in a room with a hospital security officer and a representative from the legal team who had been called in at great expense and great speed. The floor supervisor was on the phone with the hospital director. The hospital director was on the phone with someone Min-jae's team had not yet identified. And Detective Lee Hyun-woo of the Seoran Metropolitan Police was pulling into the Silver Crest parking structure, having received a call from an officer who had been contacted by Min-jae's legal team 20 minutes after Min-jae arrived at the hospital. Min-jae had not waited to see how the hospital would handle it. He had made the call himself. Detective Lee Hyun-woo had been a police officer for 19 years, and in those 19 years he had developed a reliable internal system for categorizing the cases that came across his desk. There were cases that were what they appeared to be. There were cases that were slightly more complicated than they appeared to be. And there were cases that, from the moment you walked into the room, had the particular atmospheric quality of something much larger submerged beneath the visible surface, the way you can tell the size of an iceberg not by what you see but by the cold that comes off it before you get close enough to look. Room 14 of Silver Crest Medical Center had that quality. He felt it the moment he stepped off the elevator and saw the 2 large men in dark suits positioned at either end of the maternity corridor, standing with the practiced stillness of people who are paid to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. He felt it when the floor supervisor met him with the expression of someone who has been caught between 2 forces neither of which they fully understand. He felt it when he was led to the administrative wing and found Nurse Choi Yurin sitting at a table with a hospital lawyer on one side and a silence on the other that had the density of something deliberately constructed. He pulled out his chair, sat down, opened his notebook to a clean page. "Walk me through the evening," he said. Nurse Choi looked at the lawyer. The lawyer gave the smallest possible nod. "I was assigned to room 14 at 6:15, she said. Her voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone reciting rather than remembering. "The patient was admitted at 5:42. Standard labor presentation. I conducted an initial assessment. And after the initial assessment, I provided monitoring. Did you provide pain relief? A pause. The file required review before authorization. For 40 minutes. Another pause. There were administrative complications. Detective Lee wrote something in his notebook. He wrote slowly, which he had learned years ago made people in interview rooms profoundly uncomfortable. The silence that a slowly moving pen creates is a very particular kind of silence. Nurse Choi, he said without looking up. The attending physician attempted to enter the room at approximately 8:40 and found the door locked from the inside. Can you explain that? I was conducting an assessment. With the door locked. It is sometimes necessary to. In 19 years, Detective Lee said, setting his pen down and looking at her directly for the first time, I have spoken to a great many nurses. I have never once heard any of them describe a clinical reason to lock a laboring patient inside a room without access to her phone, without pain relief, and without contact with any other medical professional. He paused. So I'm going to ask you again, and I'd like you to think carefully before you answer. Why did you lock the door? Nurse Choi looked at him. Her jaw was set. Her hands were flat on the table. I want to speak to my lawyer, she said. Privately. Of course. Detective Lee stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. One more thing, he said, as though it had just occurred to him, though nothing about Detective Lee Hyun-woo occurred to him accidentally. Your phone. The one you had with you in the room. I'm going to need that. Something moved behind Nurse Choi's eyes. You'll need a warrant for that, the lawyer said immediately. I'll have one within the hour, Detective Lee said pleasantly, and left. In the corridor, he paused and looked at his notes. Then he looked up at the security camera mounted at the junction of two hallways, a small, standard-issue dome camera of the type used throughout the facility. He made a note to request the footage from the entire maternity wing for the past 12 hours. A precaution. A formality. The kind of thing you do at the beginning of an investigation before you know which threads matter. He did not yet know that this particular thread would unravel everything. The security office of Silvercrest Medical Center was a room that had clearly been designed by someone who thought security was a secondary concern. A small, cluttered space tucked behind the maintenance corridor on the ground floor, staffed by a rotation of guards whose primary qualification appeared to be the ability to watch multiple screens simultaneously without falling asleep. The head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Park who sweated visibly even in air conditioning, met Detective Lee at the door with the expression of someone who already knew this conversation was going to be a problem. The footage from the maternity wing, Detective Lee said. Specifically Camera 7, which covers the corridor outside Room 14. I need everything from 4 this afternoon until now. Park sat down at his terminal and began navigating through the system with the two-fingered typing style of someone who had never made peace with computers. He found the camera. Selected the time range. Hit retrieve. The screen showed a loading symbol. Then an error. Park frowned. Tried again. Another error. He leaned closer to the screen and clicked through several submenus with increasing urgency, his frown deepening with each click, until he arrived at a log entry that made him stop entirely. That's, he started, then stopped. What is it? Detective Lee asked. Park turned the monitor so Detective Lee could see it. The footage from Camera 7, covering the hours between 5 in the afternoon and 9:47 in the evening, the entire period of Amara's admission, the locked room, Min Jae's arrival, all of it, had been deleted. Not corrupted. Not lost to a technical failure. Deleted. Deliberately, manually, by someone who had logged into the system using an administrative access code. The log showed the time of deletion, 9:52 in the evening. 5 minutes after Min Jae had arrived on the floor. Someone had known he was coming, and they had moved fast. Detective Lee looked at the log entry for a long time. Then he asked the question that cracked the case open. How many people have administrative access to this system? Park pulled up another screen. Executive level, he said. Director Kwon. Dr. Moon Ji-hwan, as Chief of Medical Administration. And the head of IT Compliance, but she's been on leave in Busan since last week, I can confirm that. Detective Lee wrote both names in his notebook. Then he circled one of them. Dr. Moon Ji-hwan had been at Silver Crest for 11 years. He was, by every visible measure, the institution's most respected physician, the kind of doctor whose name appeared on charitable committees and medical conference programs and the framed photographs on the wall of the hospital director's office. He was 63 years old, silver-haired, with the cultivated gravitas of someone who had spent decades being deferred to. He had published research. He had trained residents. He had, on 3 separate occasions, been nominated for a National Healthcare Excellence Award. He had also, Detective Lee discovered over the next 4 hours, been systematically destroying evidence of patient complaints for 5 years. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way most institutional crimes happen, slowly, incrementally, each step small enough to seem like a decision rather than a pattern, until the decisions accumulated into something that could only be seen clearly from the outside and only after enough distance had accumulated. A complaint filed by a foreign patient that was reclassified as resolved before review. A nursing incident report that disappeared from the digital record without explanation. An internal investigation opened and then quietly closed, its findings never formally recorded. 23 complaints over 5 years. The investigators found them in fragments, in backup servers, in the personal files of a former administrator who had left the hospital 2 years earlier under circumstances that now appeared significantly less voluntary than they had at the time, in the handwritten notes of a resident physician who had raised concerns about a pattern of treatment disparities and been told by Dr. Moon himself that she was misreading the data. 23 complaints. Most of the patients, foreign nationals, wealthy women, minorities, people who were deemed, by some calculus that no one had ever written down but everyone apparently understood, to be less likely to be believed, less likely to persist, less likely to have the connections necessary to make their complaints impossible to ignore. Amara Johnson Kong had been all 3 of those things. She had also been married to Kong Min-jae, which was, Detective Lee came to understand in the 4th hour of his investigation, the precise detail that explained everything. He found the connection through a financial forensic specialist who had been pulled in at 2 in the morning and who located, buried in the corporate registry records of a subsidiary holding company, a shared directorship between Dr. Moon Ji-hwan and a real estate investment entity whose primary other stakeholder was a man named Oh Dae-young. Detective Lee looked at the name. He did not know Oh Dae-young. Not yet. But he knew how to find out who someone was, and he did, and what he found made him sit back in his chair for a long moment and look at the ceiling and think about the particular kind of human being who would authorize the deliberate targeting of a pregnant woman in a hospital room as a strategic move in a business rivalry. He thought about it for exactly as long as he needed to. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Min-jae was in the family lounge at the end of the maternity corridor when Tae-ho appeared in the doorway with the expression that meant information. Amara was sleeping, finally, deeply, with Naomi in the bassinet beside her and Nursoon checking in every 30 minutes with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that rest was now the medicine. Min-jae had not slept. He did not intend to sleep. He stepped into the corridor. "Talk," he said. Tae-ho talked. He talked for 4 minutes. He laid out everything that Min-jae's own team had assembled in parallel with the police investigation, because Min-jae had not simply called the police and waited. He had also called 3 people whose names would not appear in any official record, and who were very good at finding things that other people worked very hard to keep unfindable. When Tae-ho finished, Min-jae stood in the corridor of the maternity wing of Silvercrest Medical Center at 2:47 in the morning and was quiet for a long time. Oh Dae-young. He had looked into his eyes across the table 8 hours ago and seen a man who was simply waiting. He understood now what Oh Dae-young had been waiting for. He had been waiting for the news that Min-jae had been destabilized. That the man across the table from him, the man who controlled the Eastern Corridor, who had built an empire through patience and precision, who was the single largest obstacle to Oh Dae-young's expansion into 3 key sectors, had been broken open by something he could not fight or negotiate or outmaneuver. A wife in labor in a locked room. That was what he had reached for. Not a rival's business. Not a rival's reputation. A pregnant woman and a locked door. Min-jae had known dangerous people his entire life. He had been, by certain definitions, a dangerous person himself. But there was a category of danger that he had always reserved a particular contempt for, the danger of people who attacked what could not defend itself, who found power in the targeting of the vulnerable, who called themselves rivals while behaving like predators. Oh Dae-young had just placed himself in that category. Min Jae felt something move through him that was cold and very clear and completely focused. Tae-ho was watching him carefully. "What do you want to do?" Tae-ho asked. And in the history of Tae-ho asking Min Jae that question, there had always been a particular range of answers available, and both of them knew what that range was. Min Jae was quiet for another moment. Then he said something that Tae-ho had not expected. "Nothing," he said. Tae-ho looked at him. "Nothing outside the law," Min Jae said. "Everything inside it. I want every piece of evidence our team found tonight packaged and delivered to Detective Lee by 6 this morning. Legally. Documented. Traceable. I want Oh Dae-young arrested by a court that has his name on a warrant, not found in a building by people who work for me." He paused. "Do you understand the difference?" "I understand it," Tae-ho said carefully. "I want to make sure you do." "I do." Min Jae looked toward the door of room 14. She gave birth tonight in a room where someone had decided her pain didn't matter. Where someone had decided she was a means to an end. I will not become the same thing in order to punish them for it. That's not justice. That's just a different version of the same disease. Tae-ho said nothing for a moment. "Naomi changes things," he said finally. "Not a question." "Naomi changes everything," Min Jae said. At 6:15 in the morning, Detective Lee Hyun-woo sat across from Dr. Moon Ji-hwan in an interview room at the Siren Metropolitan Police 3rd Precinct and laid a folder on the table between them. He did not open it immediately. He let it sit there, the way he let his pen sit when he wrote slowly, using silence as the instrument it was. Dr. Moon looked at the folder. He was still wearing his hospital ID badge. He had been brought in 40 minutes earlier, and he had the disoriented quality of someone who has been sleeping when the knock came and has not yet fully assembled the face they intended to present to the world. "Dr. Moon," Detective Lee said, "I want to give you the opportunity to tell me your version before I tell you mine. In my experience, people who speak first tend to fare better in rooms like this." Dr. Moon looked at him. His expression was composed. Whatever he was feeling, he had had enough years of practice at feeling things privately that the surface held. "I would like to know what I'm being accused of," he said. "You're not being accused of anything yet," Detective Lee said. "I'm having a conversation." He opened the folder. "This is a corporate registry document showing your co-directorship with Oh Dae-young in an entity called Sunrise Infrastructure Holdings." He placed it in front of Dr. Moon. "This is a log from Silvercrest Security System showing that the maternity wing footage was deleted last night using your administrative access code at 9:52 in the evening." He placed that beside the first. "And this," he placed a third document on the table, "is a communication record that my colleagues obtained through a warrant executed 1 hour ago, showing 14 messages exchanged between your personal phone and a number registered to one of Oh Dae-young's personal assistants over the past 3 weeks. The most recent of which was sent at 9:48 last night, 4 minutes before the footage was deleted." He closed the folder. Dr. Moon looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. The composure, when it finally moved in a very small way, just a slight shift around the eyes, a barely perceptible tightening at the corners of the mouth. But Detective Lee had spent 19 years watching faces in rooms like this, and he saw it. "I want a lawyer," Dr. Moon said. "I expected you would," Detective Lee said, standing. "One has already been contacted. While we wait, I'll tell you what I told the lawyer for the hospital this morning when I presented the evidence of the 23 suppressed complaints." He picked up his folder. "The people who cooperate earliest tend to have the most influence over what happens next. The people who wait tend to find that all the best decisions have already been made without them." He walked to the door. "Dr. Moon," he said, pausing. 11 years. You spent 11 years building a reputation that most physicians would consider the work of a lifetime. The conference programs. The research. The award nominations." He shook his head, and for a moment the professional neutrality in his voice gave way to something more personal. "Was Oh Dae-young worth all of that?" Dr. Moon said nothing. Detective Lee left him with the documents and his silence. The arrest of Dr. Moon Ji-hwan was processed formally at 8:47 in the morning. By 9, it was the kind of news that travels through institutional networks at the speed of professional panic, whispered at nursing stations, passed between administrators in urgent half-conversations, read on phones by people who then showed their phones to other people. By 10, Silvercrest's director, Kwon Song-il, had called a meeting of the hospital's board. By 11, that meeting had ended with the resignation of 2 board members and the announcement of an emergency external review. Nurse Choi Yerin, when presented with the evidence against Dr. Moon and informed that the communications between her phone and his intermediary had been fully recovered, did something that nobody in the room had anticipated. She began to talk. Not to save herself. Or not only to save herself. She talked with the urgency of someone who had been carrying something alone for a long time and had finally reached the moment where the weight exceeded the will to carry it. She had been recruited 8 months earlier. Not by Dr. Moon directly. It was never Dr. Moon directly. It was a woman she knew only as a hospital administrator who had approached her after the incident with her husband's employment, a position he had lost at one of Min Jae's subsidiary companies following a restructuring that had been, by all objective measures, a standard business decision. But Nurse Choi's husband had taken it personally. He had been angry for months. And someone had found that anger and given it a direction. She had been told it was about accountability. About a powerful man who operated above consequences. About the fact that people like Min Jae moved through the world without ever feeling the impact of their decisions. She had been told she would be doing something that mattered. Something that would make him feel, for once, what it meant to be powerless. She had not been told it was a business strategy. She had not been told that the woman she was being asked to target was simply a lever in a power play between 2 men who had never once thought about her as a person. "I thought I was getting justice," she said in the interview room, and her voice, for the first time since anyone had spoken to her, sounded like the voice of someone who was telling the truth entirely. "I thought I was doing something real. But I was a tool. I was something they picked up and used, and when it was over they were going to put me down and walk away, and I would have been the only person who paid for any of it." She stopped. "That woman," she said. "In that room." She pressed her fingers against the table. "I know what I did. I know there is nothing I can." She stopped again. Her jaw worked for a moment. "I know what I did." Detective Lee wrote in his notebook. He did not offer absolution. It was not his to offer. But he noted, in his report filed 3 days later, that Nurse Choi's cooperation had been complete and had materially accelerated the investigation's ability to connect the chain of evidence to Oh Dae-young. He noted it without editorial. He let the facts carry their own weight. Oh Dae-young was arrested on a Thursday morning at his offices in the Siren Financial Tower, the same building, the same floor, the same glass-walled conference room where he had sat across from Min Jae 8 days earlier and watched him leave and reached for his phone. The arrest was executed by 6 officers under Detective Lee's supervision. Oh Dae-young was present with 3 lawyers and a personal assistant, and he received the news of his arrest with the expression of a man who had calculated a risk and was now confronting the outcome of having calculated it incorrectly. He looked, as the handcuffs were applied, like someone trying to decide whether to be outraged or pragmatic. He settled on pragmatic, which Detective Lee took as a sign of intelligence if not wisdom. The charges were substantial. Conspiracy to commit medical abuse. Obstruction of justice. Evidence tampering through Dr. Moon, whose cooperation had by this point also been secured through a process that involved several hours of conversation and the presentation of a sentencing projection that apparently clarified his thinking considerably. Targeted harassment. Civil rights violations against foreign nationals in a medical setting. And, most damagingly, a financial fraud charge connected to the Sunrise Infrastructure Holdings entity that the forensic accountants had spent 3 days unraveling and that turned out to be considerably larger and more intricate than anyone had initially expected. The trial would take months. The outcome was not yet certain. The law is a long, slow instrument, and Min Jae understood this better than most people. But Oh Dae-young was in a room with a warrant bearing his name, and that mattered. That was the beginning of a reckoning, and beginnings, Min Jae had learned, were the hardest part. Director Kwon Song-il made his public statement from the front steps of Silvercrest Medical Center on the 5th day after the incident, in front of cameras and journalists and a small gathering of former patients who had learned, through the coverage of Amara's case, that their own suppressed complaints were now part of an active investigation. He was a small man who looked considerably smaller outside the context of his hospital, without the authority of the institution arranged around him. He read from a prepared statement. He apologized. He acknowledged systemic failures. He announced the introduction of anonymous patient reporting channels, an independent patient advocacy office, mandatory bias training, and a new oversight committee with external membership. He committed to personally reaching out to every patient identified in the suppressed complaint records. He said the words carefully and correctly. Standing at the back of the gathered press, Tae-ho watched and said nothing. Later he would tell Min-jae about it, and Min-jae would listen and nod and say only this: "Words are the beginning of accountability, not the end of it. Watch what they build." He would be watching for a long time. 5 days after Naomi Grace Kong was born, Amara walked out of Silvercrest Medical Center. She walked slowly, with the particular deliberateness of someone whose body has done something enormous and is still in the process of understanding what it cost. She carried Naomi in the infant carrier strapped across her chest, one hand curved protectively over the baby's back, and she walked through the lobby where the fresh flowers were still being arranged by a staff member who glanced up and then looked away quickly, and through the glass doors that opened automatically onto the morning. Min-jae walked beside her. He did not hold her arm. She had told him 2 days earlier that she did not want to be held up, that she wanted to walk out on her own, under her own power, because she had endured what she had endured in this building and she was leaving it on her own terms. He had understood immediately. He walked beside her, present and close, but the steps were hers. Outside, the Syrian morning was cool and pale gold, the sun not yet high enough to be warm. A car waited at the curb. Tae-ho stood at the door. 2 members of the security team were positioned nearby, unobtrusive, professional. Amara stopped on the steps. She looked at the city spread out in front of her, the towers and the traffic and the particular textured noise of a place that contains millions of people all living their lives simultaneously, indifferent and magnificent in equal measure. She looked down at Naomi. Naomi was asleep. She slept with the absolute, uncomplicated commitment of someone who has not yet learned that the world requires vigilance. Her small face was composed and perfect and entirely trusting. "She doesn't know," Amara said quietly. "She doesn't know any of it happened." "No," Min-jae agreed. "She just knows she's warm and fed and held." Amara's voice was soft. "She has no idea." "That's the gift," Min-jae said. "We carry the weight of what happened so she doesn't have to. That's the whole job now." Amara was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked. And the question was not about the investigation or the charges or the legal proceedings, all of which were well in hand and moving forward. The question was about him, the specific, private him that existed underneath all of the architecture of power and strategy and control. He thought about Oh Dae-jung in that room with a warrant. He thought about Nurse Choi's voice saying, "I thought I was getting justice." He thought about Dr. Moon's 11 years of reputation built and then dismantled on a table in an interview room. He thought about 23 complaints, 23 people who had come to a place that was supposed to protect them and had been failed, their pain managed and buried and made administratively invisible. He thought about a locked door and the sound his wife's voice had made when she said his name. "I will be," he said. "Eventually." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. Just for a moment. Then she straightened and walked toward the car. Min-jae followed. That night, after Naomi had been fed and settled and the apartment was quiet in the way that only apartments with new babies are quiet, with a particular listening quality of people who are alert to every small sound, Min-jae stood on the balcony that overlooked Siren City. The city was lit in 10,000 places, its lights reflecting off the Han and the glass facades of towers and the wet surfaces of streets that a light rain had passed over an hour earlier. It was a city he had shaped and been shaped by, a city whose shadows he knew intimately, whose back corridors and private arrangements and unspoken hierarchies he had navigated for 20 years. He knew it the way you know a place that has made you and cost you in roughly equal measure. He stood on the balcony and thought about what Tae-ho had said in the hospital corridor. Naomi changes everything. He thought about the version of himself that had sat in that conference room 8 days ago, reading the men across the table with the precision of someone whose survival had always depended on reading rooms correctly. The version of himself that had built an empire on the understanding that power was the only reliable protection, that the world was arranged by those willing to arrange it and experienced by everyone else, that the difference between the 2 categories was will and intelligence and the appetite for consequence. He thought about what it had cost him. Not in the legal or financial sense. In the other sense. The private, unlisted cost. He heard the balcony door open behind him. Amara appeared at his side, wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose, her face still carrying the particular luminous exhaustion of someone in the earliest days of new motherhood. She stood next to him and looked out at the city. "She's sleeping," she said. "Good." They were quiet together for a while. The city moved below them, indifferent and continuous. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking about what I want her to know," he said. "When she's old enough to know things. About who I was and who I'm trying to be and what the difference between them is." "What do you want her to know?" He was quiet for a moment. "I want her to know that the world is difficult and often unfair and sometimes specifically cruel," he said. "And I want her to know that none of that is a reason to become difficult or unfair or cruel in return. I want her to know that those are the only two choices that actually matter, not the big ones people talk about, not the strategy or the power or the positioning. Just, do you add to the suffering or do you reduce it? That's the whole question." He paused. "I spent a long time on the wrong side of that question. I don't want her to ever have to look back from somewhere and say the same thing." Amara was quiet for a moment. "She won't," she said, "because she'll have watched you choose differently. And children learn from watching, not from being told." He looked at her. "When did you get so wise?" he said. "I've always been wise," she said. "You were just always in too many meetings to notice." He almost laughed. It was the closest he had come to laughing in 8 days, and it felt, in a small but real way, like something returning to him. He looked out at the city again. "Oh De-young's lawyers filed a preliminary motion this morning," he said. "Tae-ho told me before dinner. They're arguing jurisdiction on 2 of the charges. It will slow things down." Amara nodded slowly. "It's a long process," she said. "It is. But he's in it." "He's in it," Min-jae agreed. "And he can't get out of it. The law moves slowly, but it's moving. And everything he tried to protect himself with, the corporate structures, the intermediaries, the arrangements, is now evidence. All of it. Everything he built to be invisible is going to be the thing that makes him impossible to ignore." He said it with the steadiness of someone who believes it. But there was something he did not say to Amara. Something he kept in the private interior place where he kept the things that were still unresolved, still moving, still becoming clear. The forensic accountants, in their 3 days of unraveling Sunrise Infrastructure Holdings, had found something unexpected at the outer edge of the financial structure, a layer that did not connect to Oh De-young directly. A layer that connected instead to a different entity, registered in a different name, with a paper trail that went cold at the border of another jurisdiction entirely. Someone else had money in this. Someone whose name had not yet surfaced. Someone who had been positioned several layers back from everything that had happened, buffered by structures and intermediaries and the kind of patient, architectural arrangement that spoke of experience, of having done this before, in other places, with other instruments, and having not been found. Detective Lee knew. He had called Min-jae that afternoon with the careful neutrality of a man who was sharing information he was not yet permitted to act on, who wanted someone who had both the resources and the motivation to keep looking to know that there was more to look for. Min-jae was looking. He stood on the balcony of his apartment, above the city that had made him and cost him, with his wife at his side and his daughter sleeping in the room behind them, and he was looking. The justice that had come so far was real. He did not diminish it. 23 patients whose pain had been buried now had their complaints on record and actively reviewed. A doctor who had traded his integrity for a business arrangement was facing consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. A man who had believed that targeting a pregnant woman in a hospital was an acceptable strategic move was sitting in a legal process from which his wealth could slow but not rescue him. A hospital had been shaken into accountability that it would not be permitted to abandon. All of that was real. But somewhere, behind another layer, in another jurisdiction, someone who had funded it was still invisible. Still positioned. Still patient. And Min-jae, who had spent 20 years learning to read rooms and understand arrangements and see what was behind what was visible, was not going to stop until he found that name. He owed it to the 23 people whose complaints had been buried. He owed it to Amara, who had held the railing in that room alone and breathed through what no one should ever have to breathe through alone. He owed it to Naomi Grace, who was asleep in the room behind him, who did not yet know that the world had already tried to use her before she was fully in it, and who deserved to grow up in the knowledge that the people who tried had been made to answer for it. Every single one of them. Amara leaned gently against him. "Come inside," she said quietly. "She'll wake up again in 2 hours, and you should sleep while you can." He looked at the city for one more moment. "In a minute," he said. She went inside. The balcony door closed softly behind her. Min-jae stood alone in the Syrian night, and the city moved below him, and somewhere in its layers and corridors and private arrangements, a name he did not yet know was still hidden. He would find it. He always did. If this story moved you, if you felt the rage, the fear, the relief, or the quiet hope at the end, then you already know why stories like this one matter. Take a second right now and subscribe, because every story we tell here is built to make you feel exactly that. Drop a comment and tell me your favorite moment from this story. Was it Min-jae walking through that hospital? The birth of Naomi? The moment the doctor's mask finally came off? I read every single comment, and I mean that genuinely. And tell me where in the world you're watching from. The cities that show up in those comments never stop surprising me. Until the next story, stay grounded, stay safe, and remember that justice, even when it moves slowly, moves.